Resuming our study of Bill C-15, an act to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts. We are absolutely delighted to have with us this morning by teleconference from Vancouver Professor Benedikt Fischer from Simon Fraser University, Professor Neil Boyd, also from Simon Fraser University, and Dr. Thomas Kerr from the BC Centre for Excellence in HIV/AIDS. Gentlemen, thank you all very much for being with us. Well, Dr. Fischer.
Good morning, honorable senators. I very much appreciate the opportunity this morning to offer and discuss with you my thoughts and comments on Bill C-15. As a researcher who's worked on substance use, drug control, criminal justice, and public health for about 15 years. I'll keep my initial comments quite brief. In essence, I will tell you why I consider Bill C-15 to be misconceived, flawed, and bad legislation, and I will elaborate my key reasoning for that around 5 main arguments. Number one, Bill C-15 is a law which seeks to extend and intensify prohibition as the overarching policy model to deal with the drug problem in Canada, and therefore constitutes another piece in the century-old prohibition policy that's been one of the greatest policy failures of all times in our country. Prohibition against psychoactive substances began here in Vancouver about a century ago, and despite ever-expanding enforcement powers, resources, and efforts, has not only failed as an intervention, it also caused immeasurable collateral harms to individuals, including people who are fairly innocuous recreational users of drugs, people who are suffering from drug dependence, as well as Canadian communities and society at large. Today, illegal drugs are more widely, diversely, and cheaply available than they were a century ago. The rates of drug use are absolutely unaffected by the century of efforts of prohibition and billions of dollars expended. In addition, we have tens of thousands of drug users who are HIV infected, several hundred thousand who are HCV infected, and we see about 1,000 to 2,000 drug deaths each year, primarily because drug users are forced to buy drugs from black markets, inject in unsafe places and with contaminated equipment, and do not get the health care and treatment that they require. Prohibition kills and makes Canadian citizens ill, and Bill C-15 basically perpetuates that approach in ideology and practice. Number two, Bill C-15 is based on the assumption that further increased severity of penalties for drug supply will incapacitate or deter bad criminals from producing or selling drugs. This assumption is badly flawed on several ends. As several other witnesses to this committee have already pointed out, the U.S. experience with mandatory minimum sentences has demonstrated that U.S. policy in that respect has in no way reduced drug availability or supply in that country. The main effect of mandatory minimum sentences in the U.S. is that they have filled prisons largely with individuals who are small-scale dealers, who in many instances are dependent on drugs. However, drug markets are so lucrative and flexible under conditions of prohibition that possible gaps in these markets are most speedily filled and replaced. There's no evidence that Bill C-15's provisions will in any way add deterrent effects to already extreme severe penalty provisions for drug production and supply currently enshrined in Canadian drug law. What these additional provisions will likely do, however, is add to the volatility and violence which have increasingly come to dominate drug markets, now increasingly controlled by gangs and organized crime, and which are also mainly responsible for a large part of the recent shootings and gun-related deaths in Toronto, Vancouver, and other Canadian cities. It should be pointed out that the 1961 Narcotic Control Act came to include minimum penalties for certain supply offenses. These were struck down by the Supreme Court as cruel and unusual punishment in 1987 and therefore declared unconstitutional. In addition, it should be pointed out, one of the most important trends we've seen in illicit drug use trends in recent years has been a powerful shift towards the misuse of prescription drugs. For example, powerful opioid analgesics like OxyContin or Dilaudid, which have come to replace drugs like heroin in many Canadian cities on the drug markets and among street drug users. The original producers and suppliers of these drugs are pharmaceutical companies. They're provided by doctors, hospitals, and pharmacies, and in many instances end up being diverted between family members, friends, even senior citizens. Bill C-15 on these grounds may amplify the prominence of and demand for prescription drugs in illicit drug markets, which is certainly not an intended effect of this legislation. Number 3, Bill C-15 is based on the assumption that the drug problem is cleanly dividable into users and suppliers, and that this division translates into a convenient separation of users on the one hand and dealers and producers on the other hand. Unfortunately, this division, while politically very appealing, is an illusion. As many studies, some of them conducted by my fellow witnesses here today, as well as myself, clearly indicated that the majority of street drug users are involved in some form of drug dealing, whether selling or trafficking in technical terms, since it is the only available form of income or drug procurement available to them, many of which are in a state of dependence. The vast majority of police enforcement against drug supply actually focuses on small-scale or street-level dealing, most of which is committed by drug users or addicts themselves, partly because successfully enforcing the law against large-scale producers or traffickers is extremely difficult, time-consuming, costly, and in many instances not successful. On these grounds, Bill C-15's provisions are likely to intensify the law's punitive and aggressive stance against people who are most likely to be drug dependent, who are suffering from comorbidities, and who are socially and economically marginalized, and most likely in need of comprehensive medical and social care, rather than more severe criminal penalties or time in correctional facilities. You will be hard-pressed to find any seriously informed researcher or health practitioner in this day and age who will tell you that drug use or dependence should be dealt with as a criminal or a legal issue, as our current drug laws define it. Add additional people to the large and growing population of inmates already housed in our correctional system who are largely suffering from drug dependence and a number of comorbidities, which are not adequately dealt with there, but rather where they are exposed to additional health risks like unsafe injecting, infectious disease transmission, or overdose risks, and certainly are not getting the help or treatment that they require. So while C-15 has high-end political appeal to be a law that gets tough with criminal drug producers and traffickers, in reality it will mean that it will further penalize drug-dependent street-level users in most instances and increase the individual suffering and social problems related to this population, and therefore enhance the burden and harms to Canadian society at large. Number 4, Bill C-15 will not reduce the availability of drugs in Canada or increase health or safety for Canadian citizens or communities. As already stated, the availability and supply of illicit drugs in Canada is ample, cheap, and flexible, and Bill C-15 will not change that. It's a key example: production and supply of cannabis, a drug recreationally used by about 2 million Canadians currently, is booming in Canada despite massive enforcement and suppression efforts in recent years. The example of prescription drug abuse represents a major transition in contemporary drug use landscapes, which anachronistic drug laws conceived in the century-old ideology of prohibition are not equipped to effectively deal with. Bill C-15 will not make illicit drugs less available in Canada.